I would like to turn this conversation over to Mark Matsui and the panel to continue to talk about how do we respond. Mark?
Thank you. At Portland Community College, we've started a new tradition of land acknowledgement. So I wanted to start with a brief acknowledgement that our summit today is being held on land that was home to generations of indigenous communities that came before us. And just wanted to start with that acknowledgement. Well, this morning we have a distinguished panel, and I want to give brief introductions to our panelists. You have their bios, their in-depth bios in your program, so I won't go into too much detail. But first, we have Mustafa Santiago Ali, who is the Senior Vice President for Climate, Environmental Justice, and Community Revitalization at the Hip Hop Caucus. And prior to that position, he served for 24 years at the EPA, had a distinguished career in federal service working on environmental justice. To his left is Dr. Diana Liverman, Regents Professor of Geography and Development at the University of Arizona, and the primary author for the 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or also known as the IPCC, as well as the Hothouse Earth paper. And to her left is President Michael Crow, president of Arizona State University, and since 2002 has led the rapid transformation of ASU into a model, a new American university. He's also the prime mover behind the New Carbon Economy Strategic Alliance, and I hope we'll get to hear more about that today. So I just thinking through Jeremy's statements, and I thought one statement he made that encapsulated where we're at in terms of the scientific data was when he said, "Oh, shoot." I thought, perfect. That really describes what we're all feeling right now in terms of the scientific data. So, Diana, I was wondering if you could lead us off. What does the IPCC, the other work that you're doing, and the other research you're familiar with, tell us about where we are at?
Well, I don't want to repeat things that Jeremy said, but let me just summarize the sort of key messages out of the 1.5C report. And that was requested by the Community of Nations. They wanted to know, their target was 2 degrees centigrade, and they wanted to know whether we should go to 1.5 degrees centigrade and what it would cost. And the report that took us about 12 months, all volunteer scientists, some people think we're paid, we're not, we volunteer. What we concluded, first of all, was that there's already been 1 degree centigrade of warming. And something I want to say to this audience is that's 1 degree C globally. That includes land and sea. So 1 degree globally is actually much higher over land. It's higher if you're in the Arctic, and it's actually higher if you're in an arid region, such as we're in right now. So we've actually warmed much more than 1 degree in many parts of the world, and we've also seen increases in extremes. The second major conclusion is that every bit of warming matters. We spend a lot of time looking at the differences and impacts between a 1.5 degree warming and a 2 degree warming, and we found it was really significant. For example, coral reefs, tropical coral reefs, are likely to disappear at 2 degrees, whereas they could survive at 1.5. 100 million more people are thrown into poverty at 2 than at 1.5. But we also concluded that even 1.5 can have serious impacts, and that's why we need to think about adaptation right now. Another conclusion was that we looked at the relationship between climate change and sustainable development, and we concluded that going over 1.5 undermines sustainable development. It undermines the sustainable development goals everywhere, including in the United States. Eliminating poverty, eliminating hunger. So then we looked at what do we need to do? Can we stay under 1.5 degrees C? And we knew that was going to be quite a challenge. And we ran dozens and dozens and dozens of model efforts looking at different energy strategies. And we did come up with a few scenarios that allow us to stay under 1.5 degrees C. And it's particularly important to limit warming if you're a small island state, or if you're a vulnerable population, the poor. But it's also important in terms of the overall economy. When we looked at the difference between 1.5 and 2, the damages are billions of dollars more at 2 than they are at 1.5. So what did we conclude we needed to do? Well, to have a good chance of staying under 1.5, we concluded that we've got to cut greenhouse emissions by 50%. We said 47, but there's already a few years gone past when we didn't act. So we've got to cut emissions 50% by 2030, and we've got to get to net neutral by 2050. Now, this is mostly a US audience, and one of the things we need to recognize is even though the global target might be a 50% cut by 2030, because of differential responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions, the equitable response is for cuts in the US to be much greater. So if your university is trying to conform with the 1.5 report by going for a 50% cut, you actually need to go for more than that. We probably need to be looking at an 80% or more cut for an equitable global response. And then the final thing I'll say is that in order to stay under 1.5, we've got to use the full portfolio of responses to climate change. We've got to, probably the easiest strategy is first to focus on efficiency and conservation. We need to shift investment to renewables, and we need to look at technologies, whether it be land use management or carbon sequestration and storage, in order to achieve that net neutral by 2050. But we need to use everything in our portfolio, both globally, nationally, and within our universities, in order to reduce those very serious risks that we identified.
Thank you. I'm going to shift now to a question for Mustafa, and then I'll have another question for Dr. Crow, and then a question for all three of you. So and then we'll open it up for questions. Mustafa, so you heard Dr. Liverman talk about the disproportionate impact globally, for example, on island nations of global warming. That is true domestically as well, correct? And so as we take a look at how do we keep environmental justice, how do we keep equity at the forefront, moving forward in response to the urgent messages that we are receiving now?
Well, I think there are a number of things we can do. So first of all, thank you for having environmental justice and climate justice as a part of this important conversation. We can look from the macro to the micro. One of the things we need to do is make sure that we're diversifying our organizations, to make sure that there's leadership of individuals who have done this work, who come from this work, helping us to set the priorities, helping to make sure that the resources are flowing to the right entities to make real change happen. We can also look on the federal level, and we know that we have to make environmental justice a priority there as well. So here are some basic things that we can do in that space. One, we can make sure that both the Democratic and Republican platforms have environmental justice that are built into them. We can make sure that there are presidential debates that are focused on climate justice, environmental justice, and how do we revitalize communities, because that has to be a part of this conversation. In places like Appalachia and the Rust Belt and on the Gulf Coast as well. We can also make sure that our respective committees on Capitol Hill and in our state houses are focusing on this issue, having those critical hearings that are necessary to make sure that there's not only a spotlight, but where there are gaps in the research, that's happening as well. Now, here's the other thing that we can do, because we have a number of incredibly intelligent people who are in this room. I'm surrounded by super smart scientists all the time. We have to actually anchor this in the reality of what's happening on the ground. Sometimes we forget about why we're actually doing this work. Yes, we're trying to save the planet, but we're also trying to save the planet because we're trying to save the people. So we know that in our country, one of the greatest countries ever in human history, depending on how you analyze that we have 200,000 people who are dying prematurely from air pollution. We know that we have 25 million folks who have asthma and 7 million kids, and disproportionately, it is African American and Latino children who are the ones who are going to the emergency room and the ones who are losing their lives. So folks often ask the question, well, how did we get to this situation that Jeremy and other panelists have talked about? So let's go back to the true history inside of our country, from an environmental justice paradigm, if you will. So we know that for decades, communities were sharing with elected officials, decision makers, those who handle the resources in our country, that we had coal-fired power plants, we had the greenhouse gas emitting facilities that were in those communities that were impacting people's health. And unfortunately, not enough folks at that time were paying attention. But now, we understand that those same greenhouse gas emitting facilities are now warming up our planet. We also know that the fossil fuel infrastructure in our country, those pipelines that now are in the news constantly, and they should be, we have 2.4 million miles of pipeline. Those pipelines are running through communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous populations. If we had acted before, maybe we could have limited some of the impacts that are going on. Here's another interesting dynamic that we have, is that our transportation routes, in many instances, have been used to move resources into certain communities and to extract resources from other communities, to separate folks from one side to the other. And we all know, who study climate change, that our transportation is also playing a significant role in warming up the planet. But yet we allow that to happen to these communities. My grandmother says that when you know better, do better. So now we have the science, we have the understanding. We also have a new set of folks who are moving into state houses and onto the federal level who are saying that real change has to happen. And we can actually make that a real reality. But we can't do it, and we cannot win on climate change. Let me be very clear with folks. I've been doing this work, I've worked in over 500 communities, both in this country and outside of this country. We cannot win on climate change if we are not also focused on environmental justice and making sure that our most vulnerable communities have an actual opportunity to inform the decision making, are also helping to drive those institutions. But the amazing thing about that is that we can do it. Sometimes this climate change conversation becomes so large. And I should have warned y'all, I come out of a family of Baptist and Pentecostal ministers, so you know when they tell you this got a couple seconds. Think about this, when people say this problem is too large for us to possibly win. These are the same conversations that folks said when we said, well, we're going to get lead out of gasoline. And people said, you will crash the economy if you do that. When we began to deal with acid rain, and folks said, you will crash the economy if you do that. Or when we said that we were going to send somebody to the moon, and people began to dream and say, well, yeah, maybe we can. We saw some of those sci-fi movies of the 50s, and we actually were able to do it. And now we actually place rovers on Mars and far beyond outside. So when people say that we can't win on climate change, I think that they're being short-sighted. And then, of course, I also wonder where they're getting their funding from. But we can win, but we can only win if we make sure that we are truly all standing in solidarity and that we are honoring the voices of our most vulnerable communities. I'll stop.
Thank you. So Dr. Crow, you've led several strategic alliances across the higher education sector, and I was wondering if you could speak to your vision around this opportunity and challenge that we're facing right now from a higher ed perspective.
Well, thank you, Mark. Let me back up a little bit. So how many of you are at a college or a university? Yes. How many of you went to a college or a university? Yeah. So when I listen to Mustafa and Diana, what's racing through my brain is I agree with all of these. You know, the scientific analysis of sort of where we are, the lack of focus on environmental justice, the totality of the equation necessary to actually bring about a solution. And then I keep coming back to something that I taunt myself over, which is, why haven't I been able to do more to actually get people at my own institution and at your institution to understand that we, in fact, are the cause of these problems? These things are not derivative of some industrial behemoth corporate structure with trillions of dollars of built infrastructure and all kinds of influence and so forth and so on. All these problems, these issues, our inability to understand these things are that we're not producing engineers that even understand what the word environmental justice means. We are a part of, and I'm going to come to this notion of these alliances, we are a part of a series of what I think of as childish institutions. The bulk of the energy among and between faculty members at most universities in the country are arguing about petty things going on inside their circle. They are childish beyond belief. Oh, we can't add that course to the curriculum for engineering because I've got to teach my engineers more things. Okay, well, why don't we keep producing engineers then that are incapable of actually understanding in their heart of heart, as a part of their design principles, that environmental justice is a parameter of engineering. And it doesn't mean, I'm not throwing all of the engineers under the bus, it doesn't mean that there aren't great and wondrous and genius individuals that are out there that get all of this, but that's not the way that we're structured. We fight between disciplines. We believe that disciplines are a structure that we somehow inherited from the moment of the Renaissance forward, that we must carry forward as some kind of logical force from which all reason can be derived, when in fact we have obviously abandoned all reason and are now presently contributing to the notion of not planetary survival. The planet will do very well if you listen closely to George Carlin. It's not the planet that's at risk. It would be our relationship with the planet that is at risk. The planet has moved on, will move on, and can move on in unbelievable ways, perhaps just not so well for us. And so before I talk about alliances and the reason for alliances, I just hope that all of us can find a way to actually believe that we need to start doing some of the things that are really strange. We need some anti-disciplines out there, attacking and undermining the disciplines and their logic in every possible way. We need post-disciplines. We need completely new ways to approach things. We need use-inspired scholarship to be unbelievably powerful. We need mechanisms by which we can actually take responsibility. We produce the engineers, the business leaders, the teachers, the scholars, the scientists. Diana, to the things that you were talking about, 98% of which I understood, which is good. We have no mechanism at the moment to successfully communicate to the general population complicated scientific things. No mechanism. No mechanism whatsoever. So therefore, the political process, which is derivative of their participation in the democracy, at least in this country. So if you make the case, well, we need to take on, 80% or whatever the number was to be able to do our fair share to really make this work. Well, we've lost about 3/4 of the population at that point who, except for those that accept things from scientists on faith, which is an error, they don't understand. So the reason we do not have democratic consensus is we do not have a population that we have figured out how to communicate with. Now, we could argue this back and forth, and you could say, well, it's obvious. I'm not saying you, but scientists or others could say this is all obvious. Just look around you and look at what's happening. It's not obvious. It's not obvious to any of my relatives. Bunch of pinhead academics roaming around talking about gibberish about the end of the earth and the end of the world. They're like, well, compared to what? And so and it's true. And so these are my relatives. I know them. And so one of the things that I've tried to do in my role as a professor and my role as a person throwing some ideas out and as a university president has been to focus on the belly of the beast, the design of the institution itself. Can we produce different people? Can we do more alliances? Can we work across communities? We just got a local foundation here, a tremendous group, to give us a $15 million startup grant so that we could build a resilience exchange, a way in which every organization in this county, you're in the fourth most populated county in the United States, fastest growing county in the country, 4.2 million people, accelerating rapidly, every environmental stress that you can possibly imagine, every resilience complexity that you can possibly conceive of. We don't have anybody talking about resilience. We got like 3 people here and 2 organizations there and 4 over here. Why don't we get everybody together that could think about climate resilience, or everybody together that could think about social resilience, or everybody together that could think about community resilience, bring them all together and figure out how to work on these things together. Now, that in and of itself is not something that we typically do. I don't mean some people, some groups, all groups. And so to anything that we're doing in terms of the carbon economy, anything that we're doing in terms of these alliances or exchanges or other things that we're building, our 525 faculty member Global Institute of Sustainability, our thousands of students in sustainability, our effort to do this and that, all of that is meaningless unless we can find a way in which all of us in higher education can begin to understand. This goes to this notion of our carbon footprint. So long ago, somebody calculated that the carbon footprint of all the colleges and the universities in the United States is 2 or 3% of the carbon footprint. Okay, therefore, relatively meaningless. Even though we're trying to take ours to as close to zero as we possibly can. We do have 100% of the student footprint. What can you do if you have 100% of the college student footprint? What could you do if you actually began thinking and altering the way that we taught, the way that we engaged ourselves and moved ourselves away from these childish institutions that we are a part of? Think about, all of you, think about the arguments that you've been a part of. Think about it. I hear some chuckles. Yeah. It is the weirdest thing. I cannot even explain it to the people that are my relatives. It's like, you're just a part of a pack of insane people. And so what I would rather do is find a way to take our highly privileged position with all of the resources that we have and all of the student footprint that we have and all of the ideas that we can generate and start producing. Every single engineer is also a fighter for environmental justice. Every single scientist has been taught and trained how to communicate to the public, to politicians, to decision makers. There's only a few, Diana is one of them, there's only a few people that can do this. And because there's so few of them, we need more and more of these alliances. We should be a part of everything. We should break down the walls. We should decide whether or not we want to be the contributors to the actual problems that lead to the kinds of unsettled outcomes that we're going to have as a function of climate change. Are we going to be actually the causal reason for that? You can't not take responsibility for the people you produced and what they decided and how they worked. Or are we going to fix it ourselves first and then see what happens while we adapt as best we can to deal with the problem that we already helped to establish? So that's my thoughts at this point.
Thank you, President Crow. So we talked a little bit about interconnectedness. We heard about also the importance of interdisciplinarity. Undergirding all of that is the oh shoot moment, the urgency that we currently have. So because this topic is cross-sectoral work, I want to throw a question out to the three of you around how can we work in a more interconnected way? Higher education, community reinvestment and revitalization, community-based organizations, research. How do we create that ecosystem to address this urgent time? Mm-hmm. Small question, but we'll start there. Mm-hmm. Sure, Diana?
So I think I want to respond a little bit to Mike, who I think is overly pessimistic about where we're at in higher education. I mean, I think that most of my colleagues care about sustainability and I'm amazed by the courses where people are able to get a sustainability message in, whether it's in arts or chemistry or law or medicine. And I also want to think about our students, because a lot of the push for sustainability in our institutions is being driven by our students. And I'm teaching a couple of hundred students this year in an intro class, and I surveyed them, and 95% of them would give up some aspect of economic growth for sustainability. All of them seem to be convinced of the science of climate change, and all of them want the university and the government to do more about it. So they're our clients, they're our source of income. We need to be responding to them, and they're ahead of most of us in terms of their commitment to sustainability and wanting to do something about climate change. But when you talk to them about what they can do, a lot of them are sort of, what can I do as an individual? And we need to help them overcome some of the barriers that they're facing. Our students, at least in a big state university, can't afford to buy a Tesla like Jeremy Grantham. They're driving old beat-up trucks because we don't have decent public transport. They often are living in rental housing that isn't insulated. Many of our students actually are living in poverty. They're part of the environmental justice question. So I think we really need to talk to our students and help them think about how they're going to respond behaviorally, but also the technological and political barriers to them actually being able to act as individuals. We spend a lot of time trying to make them responsible, whereas in fact, there's only a limited amount they can do. In terms of working in communities, again, I feel amongst my colleagues that there's an enormous commitment to working with the local community or the global community. Some people are working in other countries, but we've got people working on green infrastructure in the poorest areas of Tucson, trying to help people who have $400 air conditioning bills in the summer who are living at poverty level, insulate their houses, write grants to get sort of support for reducing their energy bills. We've got people working on climate adaptation, developing climate adaptation plans for local communities, for tribal communities. And the majority of my colleagues, I think, are willing to spend some time out there in the community. And we spend a lot of time talking about how to communicate. We know that we can get techie and nerdy and incomprehensible, but many universities now we have a big program in science communication, which isn't just for the students, it's for the faculty as well, so that we can get out there. But we also need to get out there and listen, because just going and doing your PowerPoint doesn't often work. It's better to sit down and say, well, what is it you want to know? What is it that we need to understand together, so that we're not just sort of throwing our science out at them. We're actually listening to try to figure out what people don't understand. And if we did a little bit more listening, we might do better, both listening to our students and listening to our communities.
Thank you.
Others?
The importance of listening and seeing our students as resources, their lives as possible text for the courses, for the work that they're doing in the universities. Thank you. Other responses to?
Well, I think all those points that Diana made are true and valid and necessary and insufficient. And so what I mean by insufficient is that they are, let's take the air conditioner case. So I don't know why we designed air conditioners to begin with, that we didn't thoughtfully consider the fact that at the end of the day, they're net negative. That is, they provide you this great wondrous cool down for your house or your life, and then here in Metro Phoenix, they are the main producer of the inputs that create the nighttime heat index problem. And so the nighttime heat index problem, which is an acceleration of nighttime average temperatures by more than 10 degrees, which is very significant in a relatively short period of time and accelerating even more rapidly, we sit around and we say, well, you know, I guess somebody's gonna have to come up with some kind of solution for that. As opposed to how could we have perhaps thought about the totality of what we do and what we design as we design it. Now, of course, these are things that you sometimes learn by action, and you got to back up and move in new directions and so forth. So I'm talking about there being a recalculation of what we do even inside disciplines. Why do we have chemists working on the development of molecular configurations that are, in the case of hundreds of thousands of molecular compounds that we've produced, are known carcinogens to humans? And to other negative outcomes, as opposed to attempting to conceive of, and there are some individuals that are trying to do this, but not the bulk of the discipline yet. Why is it that we can advance in certain ways that we are not working towards a particular outcome? And so the outcome is this outcome of this relationship with the natural systems in which we are embedded, in which that outcome and our relationship are positive in both cases. And for some reason, we do not yet have that at the core of our relationships between the university or the colleges and other people that we work with. We don't have that embedded into enough of the people that we're teaching or educating. And we definitely have not won the hearts and minds of our population. And so our hearts and minds of our population are actually moving in the opposite direction, with some exceptions, notable exceptions, powerful exceptions that might be able to move forward. But we haven't figured out how to take a reconceptualization of what we could be and get people around that. And so that's sort of my point, and I hope that we can do that more broadly.
Thank you. Mustafa?
No, I appreciate President Crow's last remark there. So I'm a country boy. I come from the hills in Appalachia, so we believe in just keeping things real simple. One of my mentors used to say, put it where the goats can get it. I don't know if any of y'all can relate to that. I know I'm in a highfalutin place here today. But, you know, we've had some interesting concepts that have been discussed so far. So one, people sometimes talk about, you know, community engagement. What does that look like? And y'all go pay people hundreds of thousands of dollars around community engagement. And you already know how to do community engagement properly. Sometimes folks just don't do it. And I'm going to tie this into something else here in a second. But, you know, it's like a relationship. Let me say a healthy relationship. Husband, wife, partner, partner, you know, whatever that falls under. So one of it is about trust. So our institutions have to put a mirror up and ask themselves, have you been trustful over the years? Have the actions that you've had inside of communities, if you want them to become a part of this process of fighting climate change, has it been a beneficial one? Has there been gentrification because of the expansion? Have folks shown up when they were supposed to show up? That's one. The other thing is trust. Have you built trust? It's just like with your husband and wife, girlfriend and boyfriend, whatever the situation is, have you built trust in that space? The other part is communication. Has it been active? Not just that you heard somebody, but there's some activity that's in that space. That's how you have real community engagement. And people know if you're giving them real talk or if you're just showing up and doing a drive-by and the cameras take the pictures and then folks are gone. I'm sorry, y'all shouldn't have invited me if you didn't want real talk. Okay? So here's the other part that we've got to get to in relation to this conversation about climate change. So if you come back to West Virginia or Kentucky or Western Pennsylvania or Ohio, or if you're down in Louisiana or over in Texas, or if you're in Detroit or in Wisconsin or these other places, and you start talking about climate change and you can't show me how real change is going to happen and how I'm going to be able to continue to help my family to be able to move forward, then the conversation stops. So I want to take y'all real quickly on a little journey about what this can actually look like because it actually has already happened. Is that all right with everybody? This means yes. Okay. How many folks in the room have ever been to South Carolina? Oh, look at y'all. I'm not talking about Myrtle Beach. I'm talking about real South Carolina. Okay, because everybody was like, I've been to South Carolina, Mustafa. So how many folks in the room got a cell phone? Y'all all better have a cell phone. Take your cell phone out. Because you have far too many people who come and talk to you, and you need to know if they're telling you the truth or not. So there is a project in South Carolina that I was blessed to have the opportunity to participate in called the Regenesis Project. And why is the Regenesis Project important? One, because it's in South Carolina. And you know that there are certain places in our country that are resistant to change. They're resistant to change and when we put certain labels on it. So I talk about revitalizing vulnerable communities. So in Spartanburg, South Carolina is very similar to many of the places where maybe your academic institutions are located or where you come from. They got a $20,000 environmental justice small grant, and they had some crazy things happening in their community, and they were trying to figure out how do I deal with these impacts, but also how do I build this brighter future that everybody keeps talking about? So tell me if you've ever seen some of these things, and some of them are related to climate change. How many folks have ever been in an area where folks had to travel about a half an hour to get to health care? Just raise your hand if you know anybody's ever been through that. So only a few folks have ever had to experience that dynamic. How many folks know what shotgun housing is? I'm gonna find out if y'all really been to the South. See, some of y'all was lying and you know you was lying. So shotgun housing, for those of you who need a quick definition, you don't have to go to Wikipedia, means you open the front door, you can see out the back door. Yeah, y'all ain't never been to South Carolina, I can tell. It also means there's not a whole lot of energy efficiency, besides you might take some newspapers and put them around the windows just to keep things either cool or if it's happening in the wintertime, then be a little bit warmer. But there in South Carolina, people are paying $300 to $400 a month for their electricity costs. So ain't a whole lot of solar on the roof yet. They also have food desert issues, something that's also associated with the impacts from climate change. So folks had to travel a great distance just to be able to get to a supermarket. They also, for those of you who care about healthcare issues, didn't have access to healthcare facilities. They also had these things called brownfields and Superfund sites. Now, those of you know those are very toxic, nasty stuff. They had open pits with medical waste that people told them didn't even exist, and people went and picked up the hypodermic needles and the medical bags, you know, with the little symbols on them, and said, well, what is this? Because just like climate change, people tried to say it wasn't real. They also had all kinds of other dynamics of trying to bring people together in a cultural space, you know, didn't have healthcare, or not healthcare, but community centers, so forth and so on. And the key factor is they also had a problem with the lack of access to jobs. So if you go to West Virginia or Kentucky, you better be talking about how you're going to create some jobs, or people are going to be shut down because of the stuff that keeps getting pumped into their minds about what climate change can actually look like. Fast forward, they took that $20,000 grant, leveraged it into $300 million in changes. They now have new transportation routes inside of the community that are less impactful. Remember those shotgun housing we talked about, where they're paying $300 to $400 a month? We got 500 new green homes in there, lowered their electricity cost to $67 a month because we had radiant barriers and other things that were in there. That's disposable income that folks can use. Worker training programs were put in place, so all of this new building and revitalization that happened, the community residents were the ones who were doing the building. Imagine that concept, that folks who live in a place could actually rebuild their communities. Remember, they didn't have access to health care. Well, now they have 5 healthcare clinics in the area, and they have a mobile healthcare unit that actually goes out to the schools for folks who don't have access to transportation. They have a new supermarket that's there, not a big deal to a lot of folks, but now there's other businesses that have built around. And new jobs there, new jobs in the healthcare facilities that are there. Those are jobs that are not going to get shipped off to China or some of the other places. Cleaned up the brownfields and Superfund sites. They now are about to install a 35-acre solar farm. So remember, we went from $300 to $400 a month to electricity costs down to $67 a month. We'll now zero out their electricity cost. And the excess goes back to the grid. And that creates a new set of opportunities because there's ownership in that space. It also lowers those greenhouse gas emissions that are warming up the planet. And they're putting in aquaponics and hydroponics, helping to also deal with the food desert issues, but also creating more jobs. We can replicate these types of things across the country. Well, Mustafa, we're here talking about academic institutions as well. So there's a big difference when you look at many of the most successful projects around the country, and I've been blessed to be involved with some of those. Academic institutions got involved. Howard University sent students down to help with some of the planning that was going on. Texas Southern sent students across from Texas there to South Carolina and others, and they built 144 partners. You see, we can win on climate change, but you gotta anchor it into the reality of what's going on in people's lives and share with them that they have the power that's necessary to make real change happen. And where we fall short is we don't realize that we actually have power. Sometimes we think it has to be somebody else who's sitting on top of this hill who's going to come down and save folks. We don't have to have that dynamic. Everybody in the room say power.
Power.
That was just pathetic. Y'all didn't even believe that you had power. Everybody say power.
Power.
Say power. See, once we begin to change the dynamic of the way that we think, then we can attract others to the change that's necessary, and we move away from being afraid to share power. Y'all hear me? Because sometimes when we get a bunch of letters after our names, and all of us got a whole bunch of them, we forget about that power dynamic of how, when we share that, when we create these opportunities for people to utilize the innovation, the ingenuity that is embedded in everyone, and they want it to come out, it changes everything. And that's how we win on climate change.
Great. So I'm going to wrap it up, but I want to give our guests an opportunity for a last word. And this is going to be a lightning round because we're almost out of time. For this audience, what do you want the audience to go out and do after this conference? Short, one-sentence answer, please. We'll start with Dr. Crow.
I would demonstrate that we don't need carbon to exist and change the way that we've designed our institutions to produce a new cadre of thinkers.
Thank you. Diana.
Reduce your emissions, help the rest of the world reduce emissions, and adapt. But I just want to put in one word for research, because the one thing I didn't talk about was in doing the 1.5 report, we identified massive research gaps. Your institutions have people who do research at any level, and those people need to provide solutions, whether it's engineers or social scientists who would help to analyze behavior. And in particular, I think we're looking, and Jeremy Grantham pointed to this, at what I call the overshoot scenario. We're going to go through much higher temperatures before we come back down again. And we need to be thinking about how we help our institutions and our students and the world make it through that overshoot scenario. And there's no research on that whatsoever. So I want us to act, but I also want us to keep studying the problem to come up with more solutions.
Thank you. Mustafa.
Honor the voices of those communities who are often unseen and unheard. Make sure that you are actually going out and spending real time in those communities. I know everybody's super busy, but spend time in those communities. And then thirdly, divest and reinvest.
Well, please join me in thanking our distinguished panel for being here today. Thank you for all of your contributions and the work that you're doing.
So can I ask you to stay right there? Can you folks just stay right there for 2 more minutes?
Oh.
Okay.
We have time for 1 or 2 questions from the room.
Oh, sure.
I have a microphone, and so does
Not off the hook.
my colleague Nicole, who's out here somewhere. Can we have the lights up in the room, please? The conversation needs to be all.
I hate it when the lights are shining.
Go ahead. There was a hand up. Alice, we're coming to you. And we do mean questions, please, not speeches.
Okay, just a question. Last year we heard from Project Drawdown, and there were a lot of solutions in that effort. And I'm wondering if that has informed any of your thinking or action.
Yes? Well, I mean, it's, all really nice ideas like that are, in a sense, the latest iteration of sort of a group's thinking about how to make something happen. And so we just take every idea we can from wherever we can get them so we can move forward in new ways.
I use it as my textbook now because it's a very positive vision of what we can do. And I'm also very proud because most of it was written by a former PhD student of mine, which shows how important education is to produce someone who can write that sort of a document.
Right.
I utilize it in a different way. I take these brilliant concepts and I share it with Mrs. Ramirez and Mr. Johnson in their kitchens and on their back porches. And I ask the question, does this make sense to you? And if they're, for some reason, because there's some technical aspects to it, I try and guide them through what the possibilities are, and I put it in real folks' conversation.
Could I just say one other thing? I think there are 2 really important messages out of Drawdown as well that we don't talk about enough. One is the food system and how food on our campus influences greenhouse gas emissions, and the other is the status of women, because one of the big messages of Project Drawdown is the status of women and reproductive rights is a key to keeping our greenhouse gas emissions under control. And Project Drawdown does a good job of identifying that broader range of policies that we need, not just the very specific ones around renewables or energy efficiency.
At PCC, I found out after last year that our we train heating, ventilation, and air conditioning technicians, and that they were already looking at alternative refrigerants in their program after coming back from the summit.
You have a question over here?
Jeremy Grantham mentioned his appreciation for the courage of scientists just over the last few years. But, and you know, a lot of, even what you talked about today calls to mind things like the Green New Deal. There's politics behind all of this. I'm just wondering what each of you is seeing in the politics of your own institutions and how you think about addressing that to drive this this carbon law of reducing emissions by 50% every decade. Thank you.
We're sort of past, we're now to the politics of how can you move more rapidly? How can you make decisions on something other than academic time? We'll all be dead by the time, you know, the academic senate considers, you know, whatever the most important thing is that needs to be considered. And certainly very few of them have taken votes on these kinds of things, and perhaps they should. And so the politics for us inside our institution and inside this state are, you move forward to produce a solution and explain it well. So we have 60 megawatts of solar deployed. We're moving to 100 plus megawatts. We're moving to a zero carbon footprint. We're moving to no solid waste of any type. We're changing our water structure. We're changing the entire way the institution operates from a technological perspective. We're changing the institution from an intellectual perspective in every possible way. Our new school for the future of innovation and society as a concept that I was lambasted by a series of academics last week about the use of the word responsible innovation. Who are we? Are we God to decide what responsible innovation is or isn't? No, I said we're not that, but somebody has to define what a responsible innovator is. Oh, you produce this fantastic technology that has a side effect of damaging hundreds of thousands of people in the deployment of your technology, so you must not have thought it through from a responsible perspective. We've got people moving forward with CRISPR technologies as if it's just, you know, something exciting for an academic to work on. And so it's much more complicated than that. So the politics need to be basically within the university, the debate about how we can produce better outcomes from the things we produce, both the people and the ideas that we produce. And there are politics around that, and there should be, and those are the kinds of discussions that we should be having.
It's still tough to be a climate researcher and speak out. I did a lot of interviews after the 1.5 report and the Hot House Earth paper, and every single one of them generated real hate mail. And I look at my colleague Catherine Hayhoe. She doesn't even read comments or answer her phone anymore, because even though the majority of the American public now accepts climate change and wants to act, there are people who viciously hate climate change as an issue and will attack the scientists. So I know people who have decided not to speak out or not to participate in IPCC reports because they're worried about lawsuits. There were 2 colleagues at my own institution who have literally been harassed for 15 years around one paper that they wrote, with lawsuits from think tanks trying to get them to release their emails. And you need to protect your scientists when they do this research and when they do speak out, because it's still controversial, fortunately, with a smaller and smaller number of people, but they're out there just ready to go for you.
And there's a cultural shift that's happening. I mean, you now have artists and entertainers who are speaking about these issues. You know, spending my time at the Hip Hop Caucus, being around some of those folks who are willing to invest some of their capital, their brand on these issues. When we had Hurricane Harvey and Beyonce stood up and talked about why we should be focused on these issues. You have Chance the Rapper, who's been focusing on education issues and also cares about, you know, environmental issues as well. I can go down a laundry list of those folks, but the most important change, and the thing that touches each and every one of you in this room, is all the young people. You mentioned the Green New Deal. Huge amount of energy that's around that will drive us to serious conversations about what this needs to look like. How do we build equity into the process? How do we build these new smart grids and other technology that's going to be necessary? So many of those items are now because of this moment of real change. It's almost like the civil rights movement and the early environmental movement. Those were lots of young people who were pushing that conversation. So now when you go to Capitol Hill and you see Congressman Grijalva, who leads the Natural Resources Committee, having serious hearings and conversations about these issues. When you look at Kathy Castor, who's leading the Climate Change Committee and engaging with young people and others there is a push and a change that's happening, and you can see it on the state level as well. So that's why the work that you all are doing, and I really appreciate what President Crow was saying about making sure that all of these various disciplines that live inside of our academic institutions live beyond the academic institutions: engineering, science, medicine, law, the liberal arts, the great writers that will come out and who will tell the stories that will move our culture forward on these issues. I think we're at an exciting time. And I know that there are those moments where we see these just incredible, incredible actions in a negative direction, but change is right here. It's all around us. We just have to be willing to move from a 20th century paradigm to a 21st century paradigm with our institutions. And that's how real change will happen.
So there were two very significant ballot initiatives this year, one in Arizona, one in Washington. In Washington, the carbon tax, such as it was, failed. And in Arizona, the setting of renewable energy goals also failed, and failed miserably after tens of millions of dollars of expenditures by counter forces that were out there. And so again, those same counter forces are our graduates, our business majors, our engineering majors, our social science majors, and so forth. And so I just want to come back to make the point. If you're the teacher in the society, you have responsibility for the outcome of the society. We are the teachers. We have responsibility for the outcomes of the society.
Thank you. Do we have
There was one more question.
one more question?
Okay. And then-
I was told to stay seated, which is not like me, but I'll follow directions. My name is Clara Vondrich. I'm with Divest Invest, and I have a question for Diana. As you pointed out, the IPCC says we have just another decade before we're supposed to decarbonize by 50%. I just read a fascinating piece in The Economist which says that we need to judge the oil companies by what they do rather than what they say. And despite paying lip service to carbon pricing and the Paris Climate Agreement, their business model is drill, baby drill for the next couple of decades at least. How do we start to draw down the power of that incumbency?
Not my expertise, actually. Mine is to say what we need to bring down. But I want to make one point. When we say IPCC say carbon neutral by 2050, we're actually not assuming that all fossil fuels are gone. If we're going to burn some fossil fuels, and for some countries it's very difficult not to, we need to compensate for that through land use or capturing carbon and storing it. So some people think actually that IPCC said keep it all in the ground. We actually didn't say that. We said draw it down significantly, but we tried to be, there are climate justice issues around who uses fossil fuels and where, and we tried to take that into account. I think that what one has to hope is that the technologies take over, because you can have a diverse movement in higher education, but as Mike said, we're a very small percentage of the emissions. I think what the IPCC models show us is that the rapidest way to change things is to shift investment within the energy system. And it shows that it doesn't cost much to do that. We concluded that it's about a 12% increase in overall energy investment, and then energy investment shifts from fossil fuels to renewables within that. But that, as Jeremy Grantham said, is very small compared to the damages that we're already starting to see.
So a book that some friends of mine and I wrote a few years ago was on what we call a tool that we call Retrospective Technology Assessment. Why do certain technologies prevail and other technologies can't come online or can't be put aside? And this had to do with a complex set of technologies related to synthetic fuels and all of their negative things associated with them. But nonetheless, at the end of the day, after every simulation you could possibly imagine over an 80-year time frame in which that technology was evolving, we found that all discussions that didn't have something to do with a thing called a market were pointless. That unless one changes the demand for the product that the oil companies produce in some very significant way, it will be produced and it will be consumed unless one changes that. Now, there's ways to change it, there's taxing systems, there's technology systems, there's replacements, there's all these kinds of things. And so the oil companies are complicated entities. I mean, the coup that occurred in the British Petroleum Company within the last 15 years is unbelievable, where there were definitive efforts within that company to produce an entire new entity, entire new thing beyond petroleum instead of British Petroleum, that then led to certain kinds of outcomes and behaviors within that company. Again, who were the people driving those outcomes, driving that market return, that return to investors, and so forth and so on? So unless we can change how companies are measured, unless we can change how markets are actually put in place, we're going to see slower change than we might imagine, because there is unbelievable demand for these refined products of combustible hydrocarbons to produce our energy system, or to run our energy systems.
Great. So can we give it up one more time for our panelists before we go to the next step?